Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by a return guest, Dr. Julia Hermann. She is an assistant professor of philosophy and ethics at the University of Twente. And today we're talking about the ethics of ectogestative technologies and technomoral revolutions. So, Dr. Hermann, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
So, we've already covered a bit of these in our first interview with Doctors Ibo van de Poel and Jeroen Hopster. And Dr. Hopster is going to kill me because I keep mispronouncing his first name. But anyway, what is ectogestative technology?
Yeah, that technology is better known as artificial womb technology. It's a reproductive technology that enables the gestation of a fetus outside of its mother's body in a device that mimics the maternal womb. The term ectogenesis means mammalian development outside the maternal body, where this normally happens within. So not necessarily human development, but the development of a mammal more generally. And so those devices, those ectogestative devices, really try to be completely like the natural womb. So they include components such as an artificial placenta, artificial amniotic fluid. Yeah, and currently such a technology is being developed in the Netherlands, for instance, at Eindhoven University, but also in the United States, of course, and by a team from Japan and Australia.
And there's an interesting distinction here between partial ectogestation and full ectogestation. Could you tell us about the difference?
Yeah, it's very important actually to distinguish the two. So the term partial ectogestation refers to the use of this technology only for part of this gestation process. So for instance, when a fetus is born prematurely. Full ectogestation, by contrast, refers to a more futuristic scenario where this technology is used for the whole process of extrauterine gestation, so from fertilization to birth. And the scientists who are currently developing this technology, they intend it to be used only for partial ectogestation. So the idea is that this would solve the big problem of premature death. So it would replace current incubators, the incubators that are in use in neonatal intensive care units. So partial ectogestation seems to be much closer to the current situation, whereas full ectogestation for some seems completely like science fiction. Some say we shouldn't even think about it. It's far too futuristic. Others view it as the liberation of women, like especially people who see pregnancy just as a burden, something we should get rid of. It's much more contested. And it's important that the developers of this technology at least say that they are not interested at all in such a scenario.
So, but from an ethical perspective, because that's what we're going to focus on mostly here today, why does this distinction matter between these two different kinds of ectogestative technologies, even though at least one of them is more, let's say, conceptual, more futuristic? So,
yeah, so one argument from an ethical perspective is that we need to first look at the specific case of partial ectogestation, because that is something that might already become real in the very near future. Let's say probably in a few years, we already have the first in-human trials. Yeah. And it already this scenario raises significant ethical issues, specifically about the rights that the mother would still have over the fetus that would then be in this device, about the rights of doctors. Would that human being in this device be treated as a patient in its own right, or would it more be seen as part of the mother still, although it's not in her body anymore? And that has all kinds also of legal implications. And because it is sometimes presented as just something like a more high-tech, more advanced incubator, that might lead people to think, well, then there is not much ethical, like not many ethical issues that we need to consider. But that is not the case. So it's very important to point that out, that already this use has these important implications. And then comparatively, if you look at full-ectogestation, that of course raises entirely new issues, because the whole idea that women might not need to get pregnant anymore for like offspring to be created.
Yeah.
That makes you, comes with a host of issues that I'm happy to talk also more about later. So I think there are some questions that you can say apply to both uses of the technology, but it's important to distinguish between that which might become real or might be in use already in the near future, and those new questions actually that arise when we contemplate this more futuristic scenario.
And what kinds of ectogestative technologies, if any, do we already have available?
Well, there is the so-called biobag that has been used by the researchers at Philadelphia's Children's Hospital in the US, who in 2017 managed to transfer lamb fetuses in such a biobag and then took them out of the bag healthy. And that was seen as a great success towards such a device for humans. So that we already have, but we don't yet have any such technology available for humans. We are still expecting the first in-human trials. And perhaps also one other thing to note, that next to this artificial womb, as I now want to call it, just to make clear that the idea is to mimic the natural womb, there's also a technology just called the artificial placenta. Actually, that's, for instance, currently developed at my home university in Twente. That is in some respects similar and also aims at solving this problem of preterm death. So also intended to sort of replace incubators, but it doesn't aim at completely mimicking the womb. So it doesn't create this womb-like environment. But you could perhaps say it is something similar. It gets much less media attention than the other form of this technology.
So you mentioned a premature death there. What would be the goals, the medical goals of these technologies? I mean, in what kinds of situations would people want or would expect to use them?
Yeah, in cases where fetuses are prematurely born, and especially they are looking at the period between 22 and 24 weeks of gestation. The idea would be that those prematurely born babies would have much higher chances to survive in such an artificial womb compared to an incubator. And that is mainly because the lungs are then not sufficiently developed yet. And in an incubator, the baby has to breathe, which is actually cannot yet. And in the artificial womb, it wouldn't have to do that. It would be in an environment very similar to the maternal womb. And so the chances of survival are expected to be much higher, and also the chance of survival without severe handicaps. So I have asked also scientists about this, and they said that they feel with the current technology, the incubators, they have reached a certain limit. They are unable to solve this problem, to reduce like the death even more. And they really need a fundamentally new technology to make progress here.
So last time in our first interview, as I said before, we talked about the ethics of socially disruptive technologies, and that also included a discussion about how concepts that we have can be disrupted in a way. So in this particular case of ectogestative technologies, what would you say are perhaps some of the main concepts, main ideas that we share as a society that could potentially be disrupted?
Yeah, concepts such as pregnancy, birth, also body, then concepts of fetus and neonate, and the whole cluster of concepts involving or including mother, father, parent, family, and so on. So perhaps if I can start with birth, interesting concept in this context. So if we look at partial ectogestation, you don't really need to go so far and look at full ectogestation. Then the question would arise when the moment is when a baby is being born, because usually we conceive of birth as involving two kinds of changes, a physiological change and a change in location. And this technology would separate the two. So in this case, you would say that the fetus that has been transferred into this device has gone through a location change, but there has been no significant physiological change. It would still not have to breathe. It would still continue developing in the same way as it did in the maternal womb. So then you could ask, well, has it been born or not? And you could wonder, perhaps there would be two moments of birth. So it would be completely unclear to what event the concept of birth would apply. And perhaps you would even have to conclude that you need a different concept, because that's not really birth, neither of that, right? Neither the transfer into the artificial womb, nor then the extraction out of this device or something. That would be one example.
On the topic of birth, going back to the distinction between partial and full ectogestation, because in the case of partial ectogestation, at a certain point, the fetus goes out of the womb into the machine or whatever it might be for it to undergo the rest of what would have been intrauterine development, right? But if we add somewhere in the future full ectogestation, then there would be at least the potential there for even the conception and the rest of the development to occur fully within a machine, right? And not at any point within a woman's body, right? So in that specific case, birth would be completely disrupted, right? I
Absolutely.
imagine.
Yes, because of course there would be this moment where this entity, however you would then want to call it, would undergo a location change, because it would somehow come out of this machine. But would you really call that birth, right? When you also talk about giving birth, would the machine give birth? That would probably only...
that would sound very weird.
Very weird, exactly. Yeah.
So, and perhaps tell us about other concepts like body, fetus.
Yeah, so with body, the interesting thing is that the boundary between body and machine seems to be very blurred, right? Because according to one model of pregnancy, the so-called parthood model, the fetus is seen as part of its mother's body. So when we take this model and then we think of the fetus being transferred into this machine and developing and growing further inside the machine, you might want to consider it as now becoming part of this machine. So that's really interesting. And then you can also ask, well, what actually then happens to the relation between the fetus and the mother? So perhaps there's also then a very intimate relationship between the mother and this machine, because this fetus was a part of her, and that then has been transferred. So that's really interesting. It seems there's no clear distinction between the body of either the fetus or the mother and this machine.
Right.
And then perhaps also interesting to consider the concepts fetus and neonate, because there's a debate in the literature, especially in the medical bioethics literature, about how we should call the being that has been transferred into this device. So there are people who argue it should just be called a fetus because it's very similar to a fetus. It's actually a fetus. And others say, no, it's not a fetus. It's a neonate or newborn. And it should be called thus. It's more similar to a neonate. And it has been argued by Elizabeth Romanis that both concepts or both terms do not really fit, because they have specific connotations that are not adequate when we think of this new situation. So we need a new concept, a new term. They talk about terms, but they think that there are conceptual implications here. So Romanis herself has suggested the term gestateling, very technical sounding term. Others have come up with the concept fetonate, that clearly combines fetus and neonate, the fetonate. There's also the concept perinate. So that is a very interesting discussion, and it shows that a disruption is taking place here, and we do not know anymore what concept to apply.
So I had this question saved for later, but perhaps since we're already talking about disrupting a concept like body, let's introduce the topic here of abortion. I want to introduce it now because, I mean, of course, we have this idea, or at least people who defend the right for women to abort or the right for abortion, many times argue on the grounds that at least while the fetus is inside her body, it is her body. We're still talking about her body. It's a part of her body. So it's for her to decide what occurs in her body, right? So, but in this particular case, since at least at a certain point in partial ectogestation and in full ectogestation, it's fully outside of the body, or it would be fully outside of the body, the fetus is no longer part of the mother's body. Do you think that the ways we think about abortion would also have to change?
I do think so, and this is already also being anticipated. So there is also a discussion in the philosophical literature about this, and some really fear that this technology could have a negative effect on the right to abortion, because indeed it could, for instance, be argued that if there's the possibility to transfer a fetus to an artificial womb, then there would be the grounds, we would lose the grounds for arguing that there is a right to abortion, right? So then you might even force pregnant women to opt for ectogestation instead of abortion, for instance. If you think of full-ectogestation and then wonder, well, what would abortion mean in this case? That is, I think, even more disruptive to even understand what abortion would amount to. So it would be, of course, terminating. It would be turning off the machine. Exactly. It would there be, how would you? So you really would have to think about new legal regulations. So how people do the first aspect that I mentioned, what people have argued is, for instance, that the grounds for defending still like the right or the permissibility of abortion would be to say that, and some really argue that there is a right to the death of the fetus. So let's go so far. So there is a right to the death of the fetus, and then you could that way justify abortion. Another way of arguing is to say that like doing this transferal of the fetus is very invasive, and that women should have the right to reject that invasive, and instead opt for an abortion. But it's certainly a very interesting topic, and there's already quite some discussion in the literature about what this would mean, and some people really are very worried that this might have a negative effect on abortion rights.
And another thing that was coming to my mind is, of course, if a child is born, I mean, we have to take care of it in some way. So in this particular case, if the state forced women who wanted to abort to sort of transfer their fetus into a machine for partial ectogestation, I mean, who would be legally responsible for raising the child? I mean, would we force the original mother, the original gestator, let's say, to provide for that child that she didn't want? I mean, this raises lots of complicated questions, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the way of seeing this would be that the idea would be then to look for like adoptive parents for that child. So the idea would be then to do adopt. But what if they don't find anyone? So that definitely, perhaps it would just be seen as a child that has lost the parents through an incident, accident or something, and then you need to see. But I guess the state would be, the idea would probably be that the state is responsible, and then the aim would be to find people who adopt that. But then, of course, you need also enough people who want to adopt a child. Yeah, it's hard to think of this really, because we don't know how many cases there would be. And yeah, but it gets very speculative.
Yeah.
But definitely a lot of questions that we would have to answer here. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps, I mean, perhaps we are still thinking a little bit here from our own cultural perspective, because we still live in a society where this kind of technology is not available and these kinds of concepts have not been disrupted yet. So we still tend to think about fathers, mothers, about neonates, fetuses, and all of that, about bodies. But I mean, I was just thinking that, I mean, along the same lines of what I was saying just in my previous question, that I mean, this could be sort of, this could create some nightmarish scenarios, because if, for example, a government just takes away the right to abortion and forces women, even women who don't want to have children just because they get accidentally pregnant or something like that, to then move their fetus to a machine and do partial ectogestation. I mean, they could either force the women to be responsible for that child she doesn't want to or didn't want to have, or, I mean, we could go down the route that you described there, or perhaps looking for adoptive parents or something like that. But at least in the very early stages, children would still live in a culture where they think about mothers and fathers. And in that particular case, since the child exists and was not aborted, I mean, there would be a mother, a biological mother out there that basically didn't want the child, and the child, if she knows, or he or she knows, gets to learn about that. I mean, since we live in this particular cultural context, it could be traumatic, right?
Absolutely, yeah. But of course, we could also imagine that the whole, all practices have already been disrupted fundamentally, and we do not think in terms of mothers and fathers anymore, but perhaps anyway more parents generally, and then perhaps groups of people who would act as parents, and perhaps also the way of becoming parents would have changed. So then you would also not look for these adoptive, like a mother and a father anymore, but you would look for a community, for instance, perhaps that would raise this child.
No, definitely. That's why I prefaced my previous question by saying that we have to keep in mind that we are still thinking in these terms, and it's very hard for us to put ourselves in a world, or to imagine ourselves in a world where where children perhaps wouldn't care that much about who is their father, their mother, or something like that. Right.
We already have, of course, in our world cultures where always many more people are closely involved in the upbringing, and where much less weight is given to one particular person as a mother, and where even several women, but mostly women, if not only women, are seen as the mothers or as mothering a child.
I mean, I've talked with lots of anthropologists on the show about cooperative breeding. So that's a very, very, very common thing, mostly nowadays in traditional societies. But for most of our history and our evolution, it was very common. So.
Yeah, exactly. But we now are so in the Western world, are so used to this idea that the mother and the father, and this is not even something indeed that has such a long history, but this is very dominant at the moment. And that's also how we, first of all, look at this technology and at possible future scenarios. That's true.
It's just our obsession with the nuclear family, right? So tell us now about how perhaps gender roles could also be disrupted, because it's not only that we think about fathers and mothers, but we also associate fatherhood and motherhood with being a man or being a woman, right? So could that also be disrupted, the way we think about genders and gender roles?
Yeah, I do think so, because there are these different dimensions of parenthood or motherhood in particular, namely the genetic dimension or biological dimensions. You can talk about genetic motherhood, then gestational motherhood. That, of course, doesn't exist for parents generally. That's really tied to the gender, like to the females, this gestational motherhood, and then social motherhood or parenthood that is independent of gender. But of course, the social expectations, or the expectations of social parenthood, they are very different between the different genders.
Yeah.
So this technology, especially full-ectogestation, that would enable the development or creation of offspring without there being any gestational mother at all, that I think would really disrupt the concept of a woman or a man and the current gender roles. And I mean, we see that's very often, I think, the notion of woman is so closely tied to her ability to become pregnant and to have children. And there are many societies, communities where this is also expected of women, and where you sort of fail as a woman if you do not have children. So it can be very problematic, very also psychologically disturbing for a woman if she cannot have children in like a natural way. So if this, of course, all is ultimately tied to the fact that, as things currently are, you need a female body to have a child, for a child to be born. Right. If this were to change, if this were not necessary anymore, I think it is hard to think through all the implications, but that I think is such a central point. So I definitely think that gender roles,
And do you think that perhaps the disruption here could even take a step further? I mean, beyond disrupting gender roles, and perhaps even disrupting our understanding of sex itself. And I mean, by sex, I mean male, female, our understanding of what it is to be a male, what it is to be a female. Because I mean, even in evolutionary biology, our understanding of what sex is keeps changing a little bit as we make new discoveries. But in this particular case, if we have machines that would potentially be able to create new children without any need for a uterus or something like that, then could that also be disrupted?
I would say yes. But of course, that is quite an extreme scenario. You would really have to assume, perhaps even have to assume that all reproduction would happen through this technology at some point. So then you could even completely almost forget about the past, where actually like mothers became pregnant and had children. But if this was in a way forgotten, because you have these machines and you have like IVF and then gestation in these machines, then you might not at all conceptualize female and male according to those differences. So these, perhaps that, I mean, of course, I imagine if then also those biological functions wouldn't really be used anymore, so that then perhaps they would also, in the process of evolution, just disappear, right? So perhaps even women would lose the ability or capacity to have children, to become pregnant.
Oh my God, another sort of dystopic scenario just came to my mind, where we would get into a future where we have full ectogestative technology, and then we also had ways of artificially mass producing sperm and eggs, and then it would be, and then in a dictatorship, the state would just keep producing its own children without any need for people to reproduce. And now I need more soldiers for war. Let's pump out 10,000 new kids.
And I mean, you find things like that in the science fiction literature. So this is something that indeed people have thought of. Really, it is a very dystopian scenario. And also, I think, I mean, there are a lot of objections to this technology, right? And one is, a colleague of mine has made that objection, that it seems to be absurd to develop and implement a technology to take over a function that women can just do by themselves, right? I mean, imagine how much energy those devices would use. Think about our climate crisis in that light. So how can you justify doing this? I mean, it seems crazy when you think about the fact that this is something, although of course there are problems, pregnancies can be very dangerous, they can be very burdensome. The fact that women are pregnant and give birth to children and not men has created huge social and economic inequalities. So all of that definitely could provide reasons to think that such a technology would be desirable. But on the other hand, of course, there are also pregnancy and giving birth has also many positive connotations, and many women have enjoyed like being pregnant and having their children this way. And you can say that it enables a particular way of bonding between mother and child. And there are also all these question marks related to what effect would that have on the development of the baby, also on the mental health, perhaps in general, the development. It's many question marks whether this would actually be to the benefit of the child. You might say, well, it would be a very safe environment, safer than the natural womb, because you could monitor everything. Couldn't happen that, for instance, a mother eats unhealthy food, drinks alcohol, consumes drugs, which has certainly we know that a negative health effect on the baby. So you could control all that, but nevertheless, people also believe that it has a very positive effect on the fetus, that it has this very intimate relationship to its mother already while it is in the womb, that feeling her heartbeat or hearing her voice, also hearing the father's voice through the belly, etc., etc. So many question marks and worries that you can have.
So let me ask you a more perhaps positive question now. So we've already talked about how gender roles and the concepts of father, mother, parent might be disrupted by these kinds of technologies. So on a more positive note, do you think that it could be positive for trans women? Because we tend to, as we've already talked about here, we tend to associate the idea of mother to people who can produce babies, who can get pregnant and give birth to them. So in this particular case, if we arrived at a point where we would no longer necessarily need that for babies to develop, do you think that perhaps that would increase social acceptance, at least not necessarily for trans people themselves, but for the idea of attaching a label like mother to a trans woman?
Yes, I do think so. I do think that could be a way it develops. Could be that we would be more open to apply the concept of mother to, for instance, trans women. It could also go like a slightly different direction, namely that we would get rid of the concept mother altogether and would just talk about parents. Because if you think about scenarios of full-ectogestation, you start wondering what actually is the crucial difference here between a mother and a father.
Yeah.
It is far from clear. So you could argue that if gestational motherhood is taken over by a machine, which was the aspect that man could not, it didn't apply to man, would say, what would be the difference? I mean, we could just talk about parents, because they can be social parents, they can be genetic parents.
Yeah.
Nobody has to be the gestational parent. That would be the machine. So in that sense, and then of course, you anyway could be much more open to apply that label, parent, to all kinds of people. So why would that have to be related to gender or sex, right? It seems it wouldn't have to be. So that, I think, are two ways you could say that, but because you might argue that the concept mother is so deeply ingrained in our culture, and it's just because, I mean, there's so many connotation that you have with the term mother. So you might really think that this is not something that we would give up, that is really important. And then you might say, okay, but there would perhaps be like this openness to apply it to not just women. The alternative would be, why do we need this concept anymore? In the end, there is no significant distinction between mother and father, so why not just talk about parent? And interestingly, Sally Hesslinger has also thought about this, but not related to this technology, but she has also, in a way, suggested talking about parents instead of making this distinction between mothers and fathers.
Yeah, I was just thinking because, of course, culture tends to change slowly. I mean, it's not that today we have ectogestative technology and then suddenly tomorrow everyone no longer cares about concepts like mother and father or things like that. So I was just thinking that in the case of trans women, since they identify as women and like to present themselves socially as women, that perhaps at least while we're still using concepts like mother and father, it would potentially become more socially acceptable for them to also use or identify themselves as mothers if they are raising children, also because they might like to do that themselves, since that there's that concept in our culture, and to perhaps express, I don't know, their femininity or something like that.
Exactly, and they probably also would really want to be called mothers, right? Or to count as mothers, and rather than just parent, because this is really something that they aim for. Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, we can, of course, already see, especially in the philosophical discussion, the ethical discussion, become very careful when using the term woman. And so already there is an openness to refer to people as women who are not women in the sense of being born as the female sex. So I think that is definitely something that we can imagine. And I mean, of course, something I want to note also is that it's not that we can consider this technology in isolation. Of course, it is embedded in a history of reproductive technologies, and some of these disruptions and changes have already, I mean, they're already ongoing. So it's not that it's only this technology that brings about all those, but it's others have also already done their part. We have to see it in that context. And then the question is how perhaps this technology leads to more radical and faster changes, and accelerates developments perhaps that are already going on. Because of course, gender roles, traditional gender roles, have already been disrupted and are changing. And nevertheless, we notice how much certain pictures stick, right? Especially, I think, in the Western world. As you said, this idea of the nuclear family and of the mother as the main caregiver of a child, the most important person in the life of a child. I think this is still very dominant in our culture.
Right.
Despite all these changes that have already happened.
And it's very interesting that you mentioned that this is or would be part of a history of reproductive technologies that disrupt certain aspects of how we think and conceive of reproduction, because we're also going to get into some of that here. But before that, could you tell us also about this concept that you wrote about in your work of technomoral revolutions? What is I mean, even before the technomoral part of it, what is a moral revolution more generally?
Yes, so a moral revolution is a particular type of moral change.
Yeah.
And it's typically taken to occur in a rather short period of time and to involve a moral paradigm change. So the authors who've mainly written in philosophy about moral revolutions, they are typically inspired by the work of Thomas Kuhn on the structure of scientific revolutions. And I think that in the moral realm, something analogous happens or has happened. Important to say that moral revolutions do not necessarily have to be instances of moral progress. There's also the whole literature on moral progress. And a paradigm example is always the abolition of slavery. And the moral revolution, often you find actually the same examples. But in principle, and that's something that my co-authors and I have also stressed, it could also be a revolution that we would regard as something negative or regressive from a moral point of view. So it doesn't have to be progressive, but it's a radical change that usually happens. Most people think that in a short period of time, and you could perhaps talk about like a moral paradigm shift.
So when we add the suffix or the prefix techno to moral revolution, what does that mean specifically? And could you give us perhaps an example of that?
Yeah, so the idea is that those technomoral revolutions consist of radical group or society level change, so not individual, but society, in morally significant practices, whereby technology plays a noteworthy role. So basically, the idea to call some developments technomoral revolution, not just moral revolutions, is to point to the significant role played by technology, because that seems to have been overlooked by most people who wrote about moral revolutions.
Yeah.
So an example is the revolution in sexual morality, where contraceptive technology, and in particular the pill, arguably has played a very important role. So the claim is not that a technology alone brings about a revolution, but that it's a complex process where different developments, different agents, movements play a role, but also there is a very interesting, important role played by technology. And in the case of the sexual revolution or revolution in sexual morality, we can say that contraceptives played an enabling role.
And here, perhaps you are focusing mostly on the pill, is that it?
Yes, that is the focus also in the literature on technomoral change. That is an example that is very often given, and they always focus on the pill. From what I've read about the sexual revolutions, actually, it is contraceptive technology more generally. It is not really plausible to think it's only the pill. But yeah, the pill is the one that is always singled out. And perhaps because of its particular reliability, it is sort of different. It is a different kind of contraception, but it is already earlier you can see significant changes once contraceptive technologies became available.
And when you mention changes in sexual morality, what were those changes specifically? Because I know that, I mean, nowadays we hear a lot, sometimes particularly more conservative people or people who are more on the conservative end of the spectrum talking about how some of these technologies in their minds were just a complete disaster, because apparently people became much more promiscuous and people do not care about marriage anymore. So are those the sorts of things we're talking about here, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, the idea is more that we moved away from a relatively strict system of sexual morality, where sex outside of marriage was seen as impermissible. The permissibility of sex in general was closely tied to reproduction, which is what this technology really changed, right? Because it decoupled reproduction from sex. So also homosexuality was really regarded as something negative, also because the idea was sex always has to lead to offspring. That is what its purpose is. And that couldn't, of course, be the purpose of homosexual sexual activities. So through this decoupling of sex and reproduction, the reasons for arguing that homosexuality is like morally bad and it should not be permitted, they were just they were not existent anymore. And especially also the expectations and the norms applying to women changed. And some virtues that used to be very important, like chastity, purity, sexual modesty, mainly related to women, they just lost importance. But of course, there are still groups, perhaps especially also certain religions, who uphold those values. It's not that they have disappeared entirely, but in many contexts, in many societies, they now play rather a marginal role. So an idea of technomoral change is also that the relative importance of values and virtues, that changes through the influence of technology. So it's not that something disappears entirely, but some virtues or values become much more important, others less important. And we see this phenomenon of demoralization. So homosexuality was highly moralized, was seen as something morally bad. Yeah. But it came more and more to be seen as actually something morally neutral. It's not morally irrelevant whether someone is heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual or whatever.
I mean, not only it wasn't just moralized, but it was also at a certain point even medicalized, right? Because at a certain point it was, in psychiatry at least, homosexuality and other kinds of non-heterosexual behaviors or tendencies were pathologized.
Yes, right. Absolutely. And of course, this didn't change entirely only through this technology, to contraceptive technology, but that really, you might say, played an enabling role here. And then, of course, you have to also give credit to the social movements that there's a lot of work here. But this technology, certainly, without that, you might wonder how perhaps it had been a much slower process. Yeah, you could imagine that. And yeah, perhaps it had never happened in this way.
But this is also very interesting to me in another very particular kind of way. That is, doesn't this point also to the idea that, I mean, if we could think about it in terms of, in materialistic terms, I mean, in sort of Marxist terms, where, I mean, ideas that are prevalent in a society, hegemonic ideas, do not come from nowhere, or it's not about just the ideas themselves, but it's the sort of the way our society is structured, our sociality, ecological conditions, also technological revolutions that really lead to people actually changing the ways they relate to one another and the ideas that are prevalent in their own societies, right? So, I mean, it very much gives sort of a materialistic basis to where ideas come from in society.
Exactly, yeah, because those conditions also constrain what we can imagine, what we think could be possible, the ideas that could appear, yeah. I mean, there's this argument by the philosopher Nigel Pleasance, who has written about moral revolutions and about the abolition of slavery, and who has argued that the reason why slavery was abolished at the moment when it was abolished, like after centuries in which slavery was just accepted, was that at that point, a realistic, superior alternative became available. So that is indeed a Marxist thought. That unless you have such a superior real alternative, the criticism that always existed just had no authority. It wasn't heard because this practice, the practice of slavery, was seen as something indispensable, something natural. Yeah, bad, perhaps not really desirable, but yeah, we just need it. We couldn't, our economy couldn't work without slaves. And once there was like wage labor as an alternative, criticism gained authority, and then the abolitionist movement was able to happen, and and the practice was able to be abolished. So that's, of course, there are many different. Slavery is a very complex topic. There is a lot of literature about it, but I like that. I find that thought convincing. So, and that's also one of the reasons why I think it's important to look at the role of technology as a part of the conditions that enable criticism to become really forceful and to make changes possible. So I'm always careful of not giving too much weight to the role of individual agents in these processes, but also to look at these conditions and these developments that enable the particular agents and also to make their criticism heard and effectual change.
So in many ways, our morality and ethics follow from the material conditions we live in, right? I mean, it's ideas or even moral ideas specifically are not just about people thinking about things or rationalizing things a lot and coming up with new ideas and then changing societies. Sometimes it's material conditions change, and then because of that, people have new ideas, and then morals change.
Exactly. Though this idea of technomoral change assumes that it goes both ways. But usually people often just think about the way that morality or ethical thinking can, in a way, influence technological development. So the whole technomoral change literature focuses on what they call technology-induced moral change, but taking for granted there's also the other influence, right? It's not like purely deterministic or saying that these conditions determine the development of ethics, but the idea is more that this has to be taken seriously, that there is this influence, but at the same time, there is also, it goes also the other way. So also our ethical arguments, ideas, experiences have an influence on those conditions. So it's mutual, very complex, I think, interaction.
So I have one last question here then, still on the topic of technomoral revolutions or changes. In your work, I read about this term, technomoral resilience. And also let me read the quote here. Since we do not know what elements of morality will change and how they will change, moral education should aim at fostering what has been called moral resilience. So could you explain this idea? What does moral or technomoral resilience mean?
Yeah, so the idea is that technomoral change or disruption that brings about a lot of uncertainty, confusion, loss of orientation, that this requires a certain complex capacity, which my co-author Katharina Bauer and I then termed technomoral resilience. We already find in Schelling-Zwiersar's work on technomoral change the concept of moral resilience, but then he doesn't develop that further. I think he even says technomoral at some point, but he doesn't really develop that further. So the idea is that moral education should prepare us, or should prepare people to cope with those instances of technomoral change and disruption. And that this has basically two important elements. One is the ability to cope with moral disturbances, and so in a way also to be open to changes, to be able to adapt, but at the same time not to lose one's identity as a moral agent. So still also maintain like a sort of a stable identity. We argued that this is something that also we can conceive of this technomoral resilience as at the individual level, but also at the systemic or like practice level.
Yeah.
And we argued that in order to foster this capacity that we call technomoral resilience, moral education should focus on a triangle of capacities, namely moral imagination, very importantly, a capacity for critical reflection, and a capacity for maintaining one's moral agency in the face of disturbances. And I think imagination is really important, though. What you need to cope with this phenomenon of technomoral change and disruption is to be able to, I think, react creatively to those changes. So to be able to imagine possible scenarios, developments, to not let yourself completely like despair because of all the uncertainty, but creatively react and or thereby also contribute to shaping this technomoral future. So I am admittedly, it sounds all a bit vague, but yeah, in fact, it also was mentioned in the quote that you read out. Morality has this dynamic character, and we do not know. We know that it can change and it will change, but we don't know how. And we know by now, or at least I believe and others believe that those changes are intertwined with technological changes. And we know that technology is being developed like faster, more rapidly. Think of artificial intelligence and all its applications and how much it disrupted our world already. So it seems that somehow we need to try to prepare people for that, and also to be aware of the fact that their current, as we talked about that also earlier in the context of ectogestative technology, our current moral and conceptual frameworks, they are not fixed. So it's in the future, it's not that we have these fixed frameworks, and with those we will assess and evaluate future technologies, but those frameworks are changing themselves. And so sort of develop capacities to nevertheless be able to take a moral stance, to be open also to those changes in those frameworks, so to keep also reflecting critically upon our moral concepts and the standards and concepts that we use to evaluate technological developments and new technologies that are being developed and implemented in our societies.
Yeah, if I may, and if you disagree with what I'm about to say, please tell me so. But I think that perhaps a good example of perhaps educationally and also just even outside of the education system, how people could become more techno-moral resilient. I mean, a specific example of that is earlier we talked about how concepts like father and mother could be disrupted by ectogestative technologies. And I mean, I myself personally have sort of been liberated from these kinds of concepts by learning more about anthropology, because I know that there are other human societies out there that do not care much about the nuclear family, have cooperative breeding. And I mean, if things change, if somewhere in the future we no longer care about using concepts like that, like father, mother, whatever, it will not necessarily spell the end of Western civilization, let's say.
Yes, no, you're right. And in a way, this is also a way of experiencing conceptual disruption when you are learning about very different human societies, where, certain concepts do not play an important role or have a different meaning. That also has this disruptive effect. So in my research program, we mainly study the disruptive effect that technologies have on some of our fundamental concepts, but we acknowledge that there's also this phenomenon of disruption that comes from from learning about those very different societies and cultures.
Yeah, but I guess that unfortunately it's not something that humans, and in this case it's humans in general, like to do. That is, teach their children that wherever is prevalent in their society is not necessarily the correct way of doing things, because everywhere people always teach their children that however society works is the way it should work, unfortunately.
That is absolutely right. Yeah. But of course, I would say that moral education, which of course is also not distinct from education in general, it's of course sort of integrate into that, but what we would want to call moral education should always aim at the development of this critical capacity. Because on the one hand, when you in moral upbringing, you adopt a moral outlook, you are socialized into a certain moral community, and you have to also, to be able to develop a moral outlook, I think in the first place, you need to accept some norms. You cannot question everything, because then you are unable to make any moral judgment. So you need to also, of course, come to believe many moral judgments and adopt values and norms. But then at the same time, you also need to become like a competent moral agent. You need to develop this capacity to critically reflect upon elements, different elements of that outlook. And that, of course, usually then is prompted through certain experiences where you suddenly see that a certain norm or value or judgment is problematic. And sometimes that happens when you come into contact with humans that or societies that have different norms, or if you just experience cases where there is perhaps an inconsistency between some other things that society believes is important and good, and that conflicts perhaps with a certain norm that is perhaps very old but still has an important role because it's traditionally speaking been very important. So all these experiences, and I think that is definitely part of moral education, this development of this critical capacity, while at the same time, of course, taking on the standards and norms of one particular society.
Also, because I think it is important for people to develop that sort of moral capacity, because it's just inevitable that even during your own lifetime, norms will change in your own society. So I guess that would even make you more, even not just morally, but also psychologically more resilient when faced with those changes, because as we see many times, older people, whenever societal norms change, they think it's already the end of the world, and they get very confused and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. And I guess that, like with the younger generations in their lifetime, the changes are much more drastic than they were. Like when I think of my grandmother, who indeed also at some point had problems like following the things, but I think in her lifetime the changes were much less like quick and radical and far going than what we experience, and the younger generations that even more. So that also means technomoral resilience becomes more and more important because of the acceleration of technological development and the way it really radically changes all like domains of our life.
Right. So, Dr. Hermann, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Yeah, so one important source is the book, Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies, an Introduction. That has been published by Open Book Publishers, and where there is chapter 5 on this particular technology, ectogestative technology. I also actually just today posted a blog post of the blog Justice Everywhere on this topic, and there are also 2 previous posts about this technology that people could read. And then there will hopefully soon be also more articles on different aspects of the technology.
Great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description of the interview. And look, I really love our talks. I love the first one, and that's the reason why I wanted to have you on the show again, to talk just about ectogestative technologies and technomoral revolution. So thank you so much for your work, and thank you for coming on the show again.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I enjoyed it as well. Thanks a lot.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per-Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavla Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.